And joining us at this moment, we have Vivian Fernandez, senior journalist with Network 18, joining us. Sumant Sinha, founder and chairman of Renew Wind Power, joining us. Srivatsa Krishna, IAS officer on sabbatical, joining us. And we also have Montek Singh Ahluwalia, deputy chairman of the Planning Commission, joining us. There he is in that famous blue turban. And we also have Piyush Goyal, MP and treasurer of the BJP, joining us. Let's turn it right across to Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia. Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, your first thoughts, your take on Budget 2013.
Well, I think the finance minister has done a very good job of balancing different considerations. I think he's addressed one of the key concerns at the moment, which is that some macro imbalances had arisen. You know, the fiscal deficit was too high, current account deficit was also too high, and in order to reduce the current account deficit, it was necessary to bring the fiscal deficit down. He's gained credibility, I think, by improving on his own target for the current year, because he had originally said he hoped to keep the deficit at 5.3% of GDP. It's now 5.2, which is a good start. But more importantly, for the next year, the fiscal deficit is targeted at 4.8%, which is what the roadmap was originally. And believe me, I think at a time when macro imbalances are a matter of concern, getting the balances right was probably the single most important thing to do. He's also put high on the agenda getting back to robust and inclusive growth. I mean, this is clearly a year where growth has been low. The economic survey had targeted a wide range for the next year, anywhere between 6.1 and 6.7%. I think the finance minister said that we must make a strong effort to bring growth back into the economy, and is doing that by sending a lot of pro-investment signals, reassuring foreign investors that foreign investment is welcome, setting doubts at rest on the likely impact of GAR, which was a matter of concern. He's also said that when the Rangachari report, which deals with safe harbor issues, is submitted, which I think sometime maybe at the end of March, he will in fact take steps there. So I think on the whole, he's pointed the economy in the right direction. Of course, he's also said that infrastructure is crucial. It's held up by things that are not directly solvable in a budget. But he has referred to the Cabinet Committee on Investment having got down to work, having taken some decisions. And if this continues, we should be able to see a removal of some of the constraints that have held up infrastructure projects. Now, all of that put together, to my mind, is a good recipe for bringing growth back in 2013-14.
But Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, as you're saying, there has been a fair amount of appreciation for what the finance minister has done in containing the fiscal deficit. But has he done enough to signal growth? There is some feeling that this is disappointing in the way that the finance minister has failed to perhaps make any big bang announcement on spurring sentiment, on spurring industry confidence, on spurring growth. Sure, there have been those announcements on infrastructure investment, but on the other hand, rather than simply curtailing social spending and containing the fiscal deficit, what, in your opinion, are the signals that the finance minister has sent out on growth and on revenue generation?
Well, look, I think on growth, the objective is being clearly stated that the most important thing is to get growth back. I think he's also, you've got to recognize that if you praise him for reducing the fiscal deficit, then what you're saying is you didn't want a fiscal stimulus, because you obviously can't have both. So if you didn't want a fiscal stimulus, you wanted fiscal consolidation, and I agree with that, then you've got to look at other things that will get growth up. So what are those other things? Well, one, he's eliminated uncertainty in the minds of foreign investors, which had got elevated last year, and he's now put into the budget what he said earlier about GAR, that the GAR provisions are being delayed now till 2016. So actually, even after the elections, the new government will have more than a year to look at any problems that may arise out of this. I think that's a very major step. Now, I don't know what he's going to do on the Rangachari committee report, but he has drawn attention to the fact that that report is coming. I think it deals with some very important issues of safe harbor provisions, which are important for companies setting up research outfits, BPO outfits, wholly owned outfits in India. And I think that if that committee's recommendations address some of the concerns, I think that would be very crucial. You know, on the rest, the CCI, the Cabinet Committee on Investment, is the most important instrument to get implementation of large projects going. I mean, I don't think that you can get these large projects going simply by doing a few budgetary things, but he has given an investment allowance which would become available for manufacturing companies. That will also stimulate investments. So I think there's, insofar as a budget has budget instruments to deploy, I think he's deployed them well. What he's also said is there are a lot of other things we have to do, and he's put them on the agenda. As part of the budget speech. The budget speech is, after all, not just a finance minister's speech. It is the government's most important single statement of policy. So I would therefore expect that there's a very clear signal that the Cabinet Committee on Investment will resolve a lot of the problems that are coming before it. Now, if we find that many infrastructure projects get their clearances a lot faster, I think that will have a major impact on sentiment.
So you're saying that in fact the challenges lie outside the budget. The challenges for major infrastructure projects and for major projects lie, for example, in land acquisition and environmental clearances, in factors outside the budget. The larger challenges are there, and that is where the finance minister will also have to look, because the key policy areas are in fact those areas, because a number of people may want to come into infrastructure but may not, but it's not a question of the money, but may be deterred because of land acquisition and environmental clearances.
No, it's certainly true that for infrastructure development, many of the large challenges are outside the budget. But you know, he has addressed the challenges within the budget, because the infrastructure debt funds have been put in place. He's equalized the tax treatment for the two different kinds of debt funds, the ones that go as an NBFC and the ones that go as a mutual fund. He's also brought in things that will incentivize investment in rupee debt, domestic debt denominated in rupees. I think those, and of course the reduction in the fiscal deficit is going to be the single most important thing that will make resources available in the system. Plus, if we succeed in getting our message across to foreign investors that foreign investment is welcome, and we are financing a current account deficit which will be something of the order of $75 billion, that will bring a lot of money into the system, which will actually have the impact of weakening, softening interest rates also. So, taking a total view, budgetary instruments, tax instruments, other instruments that affect investment and growth, I think it's a very good package.
And you mentioned the foreign investors. Do you believe that it was particularly important for Chidambaram to work on that fiscal deficit because the credit rating agencies are scrutinizing India, looking at India very, very closely, and if we did not get our fiscal deficit under control, India really did risk being put into junk status, which would have all kinds of implications for foreign institutional investors. So do you feel that in fact the pressure of the foreign rating agencies and the credit rating agencies was very severe at this moment on the finance minister?
Well, you know, I don't like that way of putting it. I mean, let's be clear. We approved, the Cabinet and the NDC approved a 12th plan about 3 months ago. In that plan, we clearly laid out a fiscal consolidation trajectory. So why don't you just say that he listened to what the plan was saying and what the NDC had said,
right,
and not simply concentrate on it. But let's add one more point. I mean, I think, you know, we need the fiscal deficit reduction to reduce the pressure on domestic resources. We also need it, it's true, to create international credibility. And frankly, about 4 days ago, the UK government was downgraded. So it's probably true that the rating agencies are a little trigger happy at the moment. And I think in those circumstances, it's not that we're listening to them. They would say we're not even listening to ourselves. I mean, after all, if our own view is that the fiscal deficit should be reduced, and then we don't reduce it, I think rating agencies would take a dim view of that, and they should. Right. So I personally feel that sensible policies which have been clearly laid out by our own national institutions, I think the national institutions should be given the credit for having had the most powerful impact. But I can assure you it's absolutely true that if we had not done it, I don't think the rating agencies would have taken a very positive view of the economy.
Right. So you're conceding there that the rating agencies, in fact, would have downgraded India. But Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, let me pursue.
Well, no, I'm not conceding. I think the rating agencies read the plan also. And if they know that all the technical work that we are doing in India suggests that we should have a fiscal consolidation, and that that's approved by the cabinet and the NDC with all the state governments, and then you fail to do it, that certainly would not go down well. It's probably true that the rating agencies also agree that the fiscal deficit should be reduced.
Right,
but you know, for all I know, they might have wanted an even bigger reduction, but they're willing to live with, we're at least going according to our own track.
Right, so well, at least the politicians, at least Mr. P. Chidambaram has woken up to the rating agencies. At least politicians are not thinking of the rating agencies as entirely irrelevant. But Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, let me just pursue the point about revenue. You know, apart from the surcharge on the super rich, and I'll ask you to comment on that in just a bit, where really is the revenue in this budget coming from? Because the surcharge on the super rich for 1 year is going to yield 13,400 crore is what the finance minister is saying. Now, in terms of the numbers, and many have been voicing this misgiving, where exactly do you see the revenues coming for the government?
Well, I think the bulk of the revenues will come from better buoyancy. Not from the additional resource mobilization measures. You know, you must keep in mind that the tax to GDP ratio fell by about 2 percentage points from what it was in 2007-2008. Okay, now as a ratio of GDP. And normally you would expect that if GDP grows at 10% or 12% in nominal terms, the tax ratio would also, I mean the tax revenues would at least grow by the same amount and maybe even higher. So I feel that at the moment there is a lot of tax leakage in the system. And many of the things that they've been doing, and he talked about that, you know, this sort of use of electronic systems, etc. Many of these are now in place and will ensure and will encourage better compliance. I think one of the most important initiatives he mentioned is this Commission for Reform of Tax Administration. You know, in all discussions on taxation, I mean, many people feel that not enough attention is being paid to the fact that if you modernize the tax administration, you will end up collecting a lot more revenue, even with the same rates. So the name of the game isn't to keep raising the rates of taxation, but to modernize tax administration. Now, you know, I'm not an expert on this, but I've talked to a lot of experts. And I think compared to what other countries have done to modernize tax administration, we are lagging behind. I believe the finance minister has made a real contribution by setting up an independent commission that is going to look at tax administration. Remember, this will get expert advice. Industry would be free to go to them. You know, industry frequently says that we ought to modernize our systems. that we ought to create systems which encourage self-declaration. Well, this is an opportunity to do that, and the committee or commission will be proactively looking for views. It's not something you just sort of 1 month before the budget you throw in some idea. So I mean, I think this has not been done before, and focusing on tax administration is, in my view, the key.
Right, but let me just quickly ask you one last question, and then we'll go to Piyush Goyal, who I know is getting very restless, and he's looking very impatient there. Mr. Goyal, hang with us. I'm coming to you in just a bit. I just want to get
other commitments.
I'm just getting the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission to respond to the tax on the super rich, the surcharge on the super rich. Now, the ASSOCHAM has said that this will all hit business sentiment at a time when already the economy is a slowdown. What do you make of this surcharge on super rich? Will there not be avoidance? Will this hit sentiment? Do you see this surcharge on the super rich working?
Well, let me say that I would give the finance minister a lot of credit that he's at a time when everybody must be wondering how he's going to raise money. He is actually given a signal that the tax structure is remaining more or less intact. That's true of the direct tax system, it's true of the indirect tax system also. And the only ARM, if you like, is this surcharge on people with incomes above 1 crore. You know, nobody likes to be taxed, nobody likes paying taxes. But I think these are parts of a larger social compact. If the country is going through difficult times, if we are constraining our expenditure, if we are spending less in many areas where we feel we should be doing more, I would hope that the most privileged members of our society would not mind a slightly higher payment for 1 year.
Right.
And that's a very important point, that it's a temporary thing. And I personally,
but if it works well,
around the world,
but if it works well, why not extend it? If it works well, why just 1 year? Just keep it going.
No, I'll tell you why not. I mean, I think there's a great merit in creating a notion where there's a normal tax rate, and when you have a problem or two, you don't muck up the normal tax rates, you just put in a surcharge, and the whole beauty of the surcharge is you take it off. So if you're looking the problem with mucking up the normal tax rates is that every finance minister every year can sort of invent reasons why the tax structure should be changed.
Right.
Here the signal being given is, look, this is the tax structure, this is an unusual year, we're doing something for 1 year, bear with us, and we get back to normal next year. I think it's a very good move.
Right, so that unleash the inner Azim Premji, as we've been saying, the Azim Premji tax. But let me bring in Piyush Goyal to respond to what the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission is saying, a balanced budget in the circumstances. This is exactly what the Finance Minister could have and should have done.
Sagarika, I hope people would have gone into the budget a little more in detail. Hearing the speech and making all sorts of judgments, I think it's very important that we read the budget documents, which I have done over the last couple of hours. At the outset, let me tell you how has this fiscal deficit been brought down. Plan expenditure has been curtailed. Non-plan expenditure has increased over budget estimates last year. Capital expenditure, which should have been the thrust of any progressive government if they want to give sustainable growth, has actually been curtailed by 77,000 crores in the current year, which is 21% of the budget estimates. So basically what the finance minister has done will only slow down the economy further. Obviously he had to control fiscal deficit, but I wish he had looked at some innovative methods rather than just cutting down. For example, defense modernization has been cut by 10,000 crores. It worries me. In this situation, we have a new budget which is presented, and our historical experiences, every budget has a growth figure given in it. This is the first budget speech I've listened in many years where the finance minister has projected no growth figure. So there is no real growth figure in the speech or in any of the budget documents. Having said that, he has pegged fiscal deficit at 4.8%. Now, I can peg it at any number if I take unrealistic projections. the revenue projections which he said, and I'll just point out to one or two, corporate taxes, he says will grow at 18%. Now, I don't know how they will grow at 18% when nominal GDP is growing again at 13%, which it grew last year. Service tax last year grew at 36%. Last year, I mean the current year. So where we had 97,000 crores last year, current year revised estimate is 1,32,000 crores, which is about 36% growth. Now, this is on the back of 20% increase in rates from 10 to 12%, as well as a very vast increase in the tax net. Now, he has projected a further 38% growth in the next year. Now, how is all this revenue ever realistic? We are going to find a revised estimate, and unfortunately, all analysts look to the next year without looking at the revised estimates and the real picture in the past. Same is the story with the expenditure. While he has deceitfully said that expenditure is projected at 30% more and 20% more in different heads, an important head is minority welfare, which this government claims to and screams from the rooftop. Against 2,700 crore budgeted, they have projected that now the revised budget will be 1,800 crores. So really they have deceived the people by not spending where the welfare scheme should have been done. And I suspect the next year again we'll see a revised estimate which will not be truthful, which will again show that revenues have fallen.
Let me just get Montek to respond to. Let me just get Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, if he's still with us, to respond to what Piyush Goyal of the BJP is saying. Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, there's a lot of clever jugglery in the numbers that the finance minister has done, is what Piyush Goyal is saying. The fact is, he has not actually given as much to social sector spending as he should have. He's in fact cut allocations in defense, and in fact this bringing down of the fiscal deficit is simply a deceitful trick of numbers.
Well, let me say that, let me talk about plan expenditure, because that's what most directly concerns me. It's not true, by the way, that we have cut plan expenditure. I mean, next year's plan, 2013-2014 plan expenditure is actually higher than the current year's BE and much higher than the current year's RE. Now, what has actually happened is that in the current year, 2012-2013, there was a big provision made for plan expenditure. But you know, unfortunately, maybe it was the first year of the plan or whatever, ministries were not actually able to spend this money. One of the reasons, by the way, why they find it difficult to spend all this money is a lot of the government's money is really going into schemes which are implemented by state governments.
Right.
So the first tranche of the money gets released. But if the state governments are not able to submit utilization certificates saying that 60% of the first tranche has been used, the second tranche doesn't get released. And as a result of, I think, a lot of spending constraints, many in the state governments, maybe some in our ministries, the actual expenditure on the plan in the current year has been below what was targeted. Now, what has been done for next year, I think if I remember the numbers correctly, the total increase in the plan is about 6.6% or something like that. But it is a 29% increase over the revised estimates of the current year. So I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever that enough money has been provided, providing the ministries get down to actually spending. More than that, this time he has provided a little balance in the Planning Commission, which is available for those ministries that actually manage to spend what they've got and really therefore deserve to have a little bit more. Now, we must remember that, you know, I think Mr. Goyal made some remark about capital expenditure. Now, I would respectfully point out that, you know, this term, the distinction between current and capital, revenue and capital expenditure in the central plan has become somewhat meaningless, because a lot of the central plan is a transfer to state governments, and all transfers are revenue expenditures. So, you know, what we give for the Shiksha Abhiyan, what we give for Magnarega, what we give for the National Rural Health Mission, as long as these are grants, they all show as revenue transfers. So, frankly, I do not think that the old idea that, revenue expenditure is bad, it doesn't make sense if you're concerned with health and education, because you need to pay salaries of doctors and nurses and teachers.
That's a good point. I know that Piyush Goyal wants to respond to that, but I know that also a Union Minister for Corporate Affairs is Sachin Pilot is with us, and he has to leave. So let me just leave the debate of Montek Singh Ahluwalia and Piyush Goyal to one side for a moment and just go across to Mr. Sachin Pilot. Mr. Sachin Pilot, the broad picture, the feeling is coming that there was heightened expectation, and that, all right, there's been no glaring populist initiative, there's been no huge expenditure on social sector, no big election expenditure, which is a relief, because that would have been ruinous for our fiscal deficit, as Montek Singh Ahluwalia is pointing out. But the demand of the hour was for some major confidence boosting measure to support investment and growth. And where has this budget done that?
Well, I was listening to the debate between Mr. Goyal and Dr. Ahluwalia. Very interesting. I think very learned two gentlemen making their points. I have a very simple submission. I think this budget, from the point of view, from what I think is the common man's perspective, is a budget that is very lean, it's targeted, it's sustainable, it's affordable, it's responsible. And the two things that you mentioned, Sagarika, one is about the investment climate. In the 12th plan, we are attracting $1 trillion in infrastructure. In the next 6 months, 3,000 kilometer highway road contracts will be awarded. We are looking at ways to better our ecosystem of investments, both domestic and foreign, to rein in the expenditure. People talk about why is the government cutting back on expenditure. Don't forget, 4 or 5 months ago, the country was in a position of, going really off the tracks. To bring the country back on the growth path of the economy, the finance minister has curtailed expenditure. Discipline, fiscal management of our monetary assets, I think, is far more important than trying to sound like a big bang budget which pleases everybody in the television studios. The positive parts of the budget, I think, is not just the speech today, but the next 2 or 3 months you'll see a rollout of many initiatives and policies which will consolidate our growth trajectory. We have to create 12 million new jobs just to maintain our current level of unemployment. These jobs will come from young men and women who are going to get skill sets. So the funding for those vocational colleges, those schemes, those higher education programs, and to have innovation, technological development, look at our farmers, our middle classes. The budget, I think, looks after a whole plethora of sections of our society. A holistic budget given the circumstances of the global economy. Countries in Europe are falling off the map. There is a recession in Japan, in North America, in Europe. Given those circumstances, the size, scale, scope and depth of our country, I think, is reflective in the fact that we have a idea to get to 8% growth rate in about 18 months' time. It's not too ambitious, it's doable, but it requires a lot of concentrated, cohesive functioning within the government and state governments. And I'm sure today's budget will give the confidence to the people of India that we're going to make sure that growth comes back, job creation takes place, and we leave a better India for our people and for our future generations.
But Mr. Pilot, I must also pursue the question about Chidambaram himself and your party. Chidambaram is known to be a reformer. His DNA is about reforming the economy, about moving forward on the growth path. He's written a book called Good Economics is Good for Everybody. Was the Congress Party willing to back him up sufficiently for his growth and reforms agenda? Because from this budget, it doesn't seem as if he has political support. It seems as if all he has support for is simply a status quo, for keeping the boat going, for not rocking the boat. It doesn't seem as if Chidambaram had the freedom to be himself. It doesn't seem as if Chidambaram had the freedom to be the reformist finance minister that he is. Is the Congress Party convinced of the reforms agenda, of the growth agenda, or is there no consensus in your party about which track to follow?
Okay, let me make it very clear, Sagarika. The finance minister is a Congress finance minister. The budget is the UPS budget, it's the Congress's budget. So please don't try and divorce him from what the Congress ideology is. He had full freedom to make a budget that is living up to the expectations of our party, of our country, of 1.2 billion people. The fact that you think he's not being reformist enough, I think it's mistaken, because he is trying to create the growth momentum back. He's helping industry, he's giving rebates to middle classes, he's also trying to make sure that the purchasing power of our people becomes more. Idea is not to have more money in your pockets, but to make sure that your rupee gets you as much as you require to maintain a sustainable, respectable livelihood. As far as the Congress party is concerned, let me reiterate, the Congress party fully stands behind the finance minister's budget speech and his way of functioning. We support him, and I'm sure that he is the one person who will be able to take our Congress ideology into the furthest corners of our country. This budget speech is only a part of what he's going to do in the next few months.
Right, Mr. Pilot, just before you go, I know you're in a hurry to leave us. I just want to ask you one last question. I asked this to Montek Singh Ahluwalia as well. Is the challenge now outside the budget? Is the challenge now to get that land acquisition done? Is the challenge to get those environmental clearances done? Because I know that 2 days ago when you had your second round of 2G auction, there was just a single bid. None of the Indian telecom companies, whether Bharti Telecom, Vodafone, Idea Cellular, all stayed away from the bidding process of your second round of 2G auction. So your hopes of raising that 45,000 crore were dashed. Only one company came forward with a bid for your 2G auction. Now, is the major challenge, therefore, outside the budget to actually get the legal framework, the regulatory framework, the land acquisition, the environmental clearances, all that done? Because unless that is done, that really is where the challenge is. Would you accept that?
You see, there are multiple agencies in our country. There is the court of law, there is environment concerns, there are state governments, and there are multiple things that we have to do to put together. And I think you're quite right in saying that we've got to be able to culminate a host of these issues into one area and one platform where we are able to give clearances, give go-aheads, and the kind of investments. Why should it take 10 years to make a highway in this country? Why should it take 15 years in a high court to clear a case? So we have to work on all fronts. But I think today's limited discussion is about the budget and the way forward, for the next 12 months in the fiscal year. The challenge for the government really is to live up to the things that we've already done in the past, which is, whether it's NREGA, whether it's right to education, right to information, and now, more importantly, right to food security. These are all not just populist. I think it's the wrong term to say populist. This is what we need to do, because the market forces will not feed the hungry in this country. The market forces will not give subsidy to the poorest of poor in our country, the tribal, the Dalits, the scheduled caste. Those are people for which we have a sovereign responsibility as government.
You're speaking like a true politician heading into elections. But I know
not at all. Elections can come and go. This is a good budget, Sagarika. No matter what judgment you people pass in the studio rooms, the country has responded positively. And I think the true colors of this great budget will come out in the next few weeks.
But does it worry you that the Sensex has tanked, that the markets have given it a big thumbs down?
India wins the Cricket World Cup, the Sensex goes up and down. I don't think we should link it to the Sensex going up and down. People take time to digest the information and then act accordingly. I really don't attach too much importance into the markets going up and down while the budget speech is still being read out.
And it's been characterized as a do no harm budget, but not a game changer budget. How would you respond to that?
You can't change game every year. I mean, we have to go on the growth trajectory. We have to keep it sustained, keep our heads down, and from a difficult fiscal position 3-4 months ago, we've come out of it. This is giving confidence to the entire world. Don't forget, India is not just a small country. We are also now the epicenter of investments globally, and those investments will create those jobs. So we have to give that confidence to the entire global community that we are here to stay, to have investments, to have manufacturing, to have jobs, to have services, to give to our people. This is a balanced budget. I don't understand why we have to change the game every year and have a big bang budget which is going to really cause all sorts of issues around the world. This budget I think is a very understated but a very powerful budget, and like I said earlier, the true benefits of the budget we'll see in the next 6 to 8 months.
Right, Mr. Sachin Pilot, thanks very much indeed for joining us. I know you have to run away, so I'm going to let you go. Thanks so much. Joining us now is Mr. Yashwant Sinha, MP and senior leader of the BJP, as well as, of course, former finance minister. Mr. Yashwant Sinha, thanks so much for joining us. Your take on budget 2013.
To tell you the truth, quite frankly, I am disappointed, because we all know that the economy is in a severe crisis. It is in a mess. It's a mess which has been brought about by the UPA government, and one expected that in their last and farewell budget, they will be able to do something big which will take the Indian economy out of its current morass. But nothing of that kind has happened. Mr. Chidambaram has proved to be a god of small things in this budget. It is just a collection of a whole lot of small announcements without anything big.
And but respond to what you've heard from Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia. I don't know if you were here when he was talking to us. Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia saying that the signal contribution of the finance minister, the big achievement, is containing that fiscal deficit, that soaring fiscal deficit, which, you know, as the RBI governor has said, is the highest fiscal deficit in history. You know, the finance minister has in fact contained that, has not engaged in the kind of big bang spending that some were fearing. So your comments on that?
Absolutely. My comment is very simple. I would have been the first person to stand and applaud the finance minister, but he has taken the easy way out. He has reduced the plan expenditure of the current year by 95,000 crore rupees. And what he has saved here is something that he has spent on unproductive expenditure, like subsidies. So the revenue deficit of the government for the current year, which was estimated to be 3.4%, has gone up to 3.9%, and the fiscal deficit has been restrained at 5.2%.
Right.
Now, it is the quality of expenditure, as we all know, which matters. It's not expenditure per se. He has raised the subsidy bill, which was completely underestimated in the budget this year, by 67,000 crore rupees.
Right.
Now, these are the things that we don't often notice.
Right. Do you want to respond to that, Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, if you're here? Do you want to respond to what Mr. Yashwant Sinha is saying?
No, I think, you know, he's referring really to the current year. I don't believe that what has happened is a reduction in plan expenditure consciously. What has actually happened is, I think I explained earlier, is that many ministries have not actually been able to spend the money that was allocated to them, simply because they were not able to get confirmation from state governments that the utilization certificates that relate to the release of the first tranche. So, you know, while we've tried to avoid additional expenditures being cleared, the fact that what was provided in the budget didn't get spent is to a large extent due to management and implementation constraints, some maybe in the ministries and many in the state governments. Right. Obviously, that is what happened. On subsidies, of course, the government, the finance minister, everybody has said that we do need to bring subsidies down, and, you know, the most important subsidy in that context is really the ballooning subsidy on petroleum. And I think what the government has done on diesel prices is actually a very, very reasonable and at the same time graduated response. Because, you know, the total diesel subsidy has become 91,000 crores. Now, recognizing that you can't do this, eliminate this immediately, what they've done is they've put in place a gradual process of adjustment, which will get rid of it in 18 months' time. And I think when people look at what's happening to subsidies, the containment of these subsidies is a very important step in bringing back fiscal rectitude.
Right. And let me put to Mr. Yashwant Sinha, the fact is that given the magnitude of that fiscal deficit, small steps are being taken, incremental steps are being taken. Already over the last 6 months, the government has been bringing down the fuel subsidy. The government has been enacting reforms, has been going in for FDI. So clearly, small incremental steps are being taken. Aren't you hoping for too much, too quickly, to expect everything to be announced in a budget?
You know, we had deregulated petroleum product prices with effect from 1st April 2002. We tend to forget these things. This government came, undid that deregulation. They went back to government control. Now they are reinventing the wheel and trying to find virtue in deregulation of petrol and diesel. So be that as it may, the point I'm making is, of course, incremental steps. But incremental steps will only have incremental impact. So if we are looking at a big picture next year, I don't see it. You know, the economic survey says the growth rate next year is going to be 6.1, between 6.1 and 6.7%. and the calculation in this budget will also show that a nominal growth rate of a little over 11% has been assumed. I don't see it coming. It will be more the inflationary content in the economy which will provide to the nominal growth in GDP rather than real growth in the GDP. We have seen today the figures of the third quarter of this current year, which is 4.5% of growth. So what are we talking about?
Right.
This economy is in a deep crisis. And this is not the budget to deal with a deep crisis.
This is not a crisis. This is not a budget that will deal with economic crisis. Srivatsa Krishna, who is here, who is an IAS officer on sabbatical, has a question for you, Mr. Sinha.
Sir, my question to you is, if you look at the budget speeches, which I'm sure you know by heart, from 1991 budget till today, every single budget speech has spoken about the virtues of fiscal consolidation. And you introduced the FRBM in 2003, and almost every single time from then till now it has been breached. So aren't we giving a little less credit than deserved for, except for 2 years, 2004 and 2008, when the fiscal deficit target was actually met? Aren't we giving a little less credit than probably due for getting in control a fiscal deficit which had reached absolutely alarming proportions? It's a different question. It shouldn't have reached there in the first place. But given that it was there,
no, but
the fact that it was contained...
Yeah, Srivatsa,
sir.
The point I'd like to make is that we brought the FRBM.
Right.
And according to the FRBM in 2007-8, you will recall, fiscal deficit came down to 2.5% of the GDP. Why did we take leave of the FRBM Act in the first place?
True.
And now we are trying to have a new FRBM and all that. And you first completely spoil the situation, and then you try and correct it. In both situations, you are taking credit. When Mr. Chidambaram breached the fiscal deficit and raised it to 6% of the GDP in 2008-9, he expected us to stand up and applaud him. And he said this was to meet the global crisis. The global crisis persists. And today he's reduced expenditure by 60,000 crore in the current year, and he's raised it only by 5% for the next year. And we are still, he expects us to applaud. I mean, he was right then, or he's wrong today. He can't be right in both situations. Now, it is the politics of this that I am protesting against. And in reply to what Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia said, I will say the state governments have been there from before, the central ministries have been there from before, and despite that, the deputy chairperson of the Planning Commission has always fought the finance minister like a tiger, unleashed tiger, for more allocations. And I am surprised that Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia has meekly accepted these cuts and a raise of mere 5% in the next year's budget.
Do you want to respond to that, Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia?
Yeah, I want to make 2 points on this. First of all, going back to 2008 and why the fiscal deficit was increased, I think as Mr. Yashwant Sinha said, that was a period when a fiscal stimulus was really needed. And if you've had a couple of years of fiscal consolidation, I mean, from about 2004 onwards, there was a steady reduction in the fiscal deficit. So it's quite logical in 2008 to have a big increase in the fiscal deficit. And let me say that fiscal stimulus did have an impact, because after a 1-year slowdown, the economy bounced back again at 8.6% and then 9.3%. This is not the same crisis that we are facing. I mean, the global crisis of 2008 is what was associated with what went wrong in Lehman Brothers. The current crisis is really what exploded with the sovereign debt crisis in the Eurozone. That is widely regarded to be much more pervasive because the whole of Europe is in recession. So I think the global situation today is more difficult. Now, on the question of deputy chairman fighting, of course we fight for more allocations. I would love to have more allocations. But, with the greatest respect, it would be irresponsible at a point where you run out of fiscal space People all over the world are looking at fiscal consolidation.
Right.
The UK government has been downgraded. I believe the Chancellor of the UK has been quoted somewhere saying he wants to sue the rating agencies. Well, you got to judge what kind of a position you're in.
So
and quite frankly, let me say, making a fetish of expenditure is a huge mistake. Because it is not that not enough money is spent. If you go to the public, what are they telling us? What they're telling us is, please improve the quality of expenditure. And frankly, in the Planning Commission, it's time we try to do a little bit of that.
So you're in fact applauding.
We set up an independent evaluation of.
You're applauding the end of extravagant welfareism. You're applauding the fact that there has been no big spend on social sector.
No, I'm not. Look, expenditure is not the same thing as welfareism, because there's a lot of expenditure that has nothing to do with welfare. I'm in fact of the view that where it comes to genuine welfare-related expenditure, we should bend over backwards to make sure that that's not constrained, even if it's a little bit inefficient. But there's a lot of other expenditure which is really not delivering the end result we want. And quite frankly, if you keep expanding the expenditure, why would anyone ever try to improve performance? So for 1 year, let's send a signal. And by the way, although this is what the finance minister has done, this year, while the ministries have been, I think, given quite a big increase over what they actually spent, we've kept a certain amount aside in the Planning Commission. That those who are able to get their act together, to get their schemes approved, to get the money moving, we will be able to allocate from this fund in order to protect their program. So I think, I feel a reasonable, well-balanced effort.
A reasonable, well-balanced effort. Go ahead. Mr. Ahluwalia, Srivatsa Krishna has a question for you as well.
Sir, two quick questions. Sir, if you look at the external commercial borrowings, they are reaching an alarming proportion. It's about 70% of our reserves today. And given the fact that the current account deficit stands at a historical high, we weren't there at this number even in 1991, of 5.5% of GDP. These two put together, doesn't it make us much more vulnerable to any external crisis or any temporary slowdown in inflows? That's question one. And second, given the fact that a lot of projects are stuck, about 1,000 odd projects worth 480,000 crores are rumored to be stuck for environmental clearances, and 4 lakh crores is pending in various income tax tribunals in disputes. Can the government do something, not necessarily in the budget but otherwise, to resolve this, which would invariably kickstart growth?
No, I think both very good questions. On the question of the external commercial borrowing, it is true that our corporate sector borrowed extensively during a period when they also did a lot of investment. So actually, if you look at the last 3 or 4 years, except last year, investment boomed and it was financed by a lot of borrowing. That does introduce an element of vulnerability, especially since the current account deficit is actually high. I think the finance minister explicitly mentioned that this is a macro imbalance that needs to be addressed. And the urgency of addressing the fiscal deficit is just a mirror image of the urgency of addressing the current account deficit. The current account deficit is just a measure of excess demand in the system. Now, if the fiscal deficit had not increased, one would have said the excess demand is coming from elsewhere. But actually, since the fiscal deficit had increased, it's quite clear that a large part of the adjustment has to be in bringing the fiscal deficit down. That's exactly what the finance minister has done, and I think it's the right thing. On the second question, you're absolutely right. It is one of the major impediments to the revival of growth that large projects are held up because of one or other clearance. I'm not saying, by the way, that these clearances should be ignored. I think the issues are important. That's why what we've done is we've set up a new mechanism, the Cabinet Committee on Investment. So with our different views, the problem with our system is there is nobody taking a holistic view. I mean, you have a project, it's almost complete, huge amounts of money have been spent, and so some clearance that is needed, the person giving that clearance takes a segmented view. So I think the Cabinet Committee on Investment is something that will enable the government to take.
But that's a very valuable point.
Now, that doesn't mean, by the way, that you ignore environment. Maybe you just have to do more compensatory environment. Maybe you have to force them to do something more. I think that we need this, and we don't need it forever.
Right.
If we have this committee functioning well for 6 months, it will set a precedent that will enable the rest of the system to move fast.
Right, I think you made a very valuable point there. I think I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we're up against time. You made a very valuable point, saying significant challenges lie really outside the budget. As the finance minister himself said, that the budget is just one day in the year. There's a massive amount of clearances, and as you mentioned, the kind of hurdles that are there that the Cabinet Committee on Investment will have to look into. Let me bring in our other panelists here. Sumant Sinha, founder and chairman of Rewind Power. Your father was on with us just a minute ago. You are, in fact, Mr. Yashwant Sinha's son, of course. Respond to what Montek Singh Ahluwalia is saying, that the biggest achievement has been this containing of this soaring fiscal deficit. The credit ratings were looking at India very carefully. We simply could not have continued with this kind of fiscal deficit without going completely bankrupt. Of course, you can blame this government itself for this fiscal deficit. You can say that it's the extravagant welfareism of this government that has emptied India's coffers. But would you say that in this budget, a welcome corrective at least has been put in, that curb has been put on spending?
Well, no, I totally agree with you, Sagrika. I think, the economy was really going down absolutely the wrong path on a number of different counts. Fiscal deficit, current account deficit, lack of clearances in investments and so on. And I think once the finance minister took over 6 months ago, at least from that point on, he's made it very clear where his priorities are. And those priorities are right. There's no dispute in those priorities. And in those last 6 months, he's tried to correct various of these imbalances.
But you're still disappointed.
No, hold on a second. And the first one that he's tackled and dealt with is the fiscal deficit, which in the sequencing of events is absolutely the right thing to do. Having said that, it is not sufficient by itself. The current account deficit is leaving us very vulnerable, has to be dealt with very seriously. And behind that, the question is ultimately what is going to be done to really kickstart the economy. Q3 GDP numbers have just come out at 4.5%, which shows that the economy continues to decelerate. And the question now is, how is this even going to get back up to 6% plus? So something has to give, something has to happen to really start having investments coming into the economy. And when he also related to the fact that if you have to fund the current account deficit,
hasn't he provided for investment in infrastructure, the roads, ports, Jawaharlal Nehru renewal mission?
There's been a lot of talk and saying that we want to address these things, but there's actually been less of actually addressing them. There have been a couple of things. I will not say there haven't been. But all in all, there's been a corporate tax surcharge. So that has taken away with one hand what he's given with the ATI benefit on the other hand. So all in all, if you look at it, I would say it's fairly neutral for the infrastructure segment and the corporate sector. And I think that's really where, if I have a crib with this budget, that's really where it is. That perhaps there could have been a few bright ideas or good ideas given the intellectual capital in the government to actually figure out what is the right way of kickstarting
you don't think the 50,000 crore tax-free infrastructure bond?
No, the point is, the thing is, when you dig into each and every one of these, there's always some issue, right? Last year the number was 25,000 crores. That number was not fully subscribed to, right? Ultimately, these institutions that are allowed to borrow, but then they don't online that benefit to the actual infrastructure borrowers. So why not allow infrastructure borrowers or companies to directly borrow from the market? So those are the kinds of things
that's a very important point. Montek Singh Ahluwalia is still with us. I just want to put to you, what is there in this budget, to put it very simply, that will kickstart the economy? I know you're saying it's balanced and it's, it's the need of the hour, and given the circumstances and the fiscal deficit has been controlled. But, what will actually push the economy? What will kickstart the economy? What will, rescue the economic crisis? What is there in this budget for that?
It's very interesting that the image kickstart the economy isn't actually the right image for dealing with a crisis. Kickstart, the origin of kickstart is what you do with a motorcycle. I mean, there's one kick and the engine comes to life and you take off.
A stalled motorcycle.
Essence of a crisis is multiple problems have arisen, some external, some internal, The road is a bit bumpy. So if you did kickstart the economy without taking care of the bumps and removing the rocks, you'd only be moving slowly. I think it's just a tough job. You've got to address all the problems. I think someone's right that many of the problems are outside the budget. It's also true that, you know, he's put them on the agenda. He hasn't actually sat down and said, because I'm signing this piece of paper, this problem is solved. But they're not budget-type problems. They're not problems where you can say, by introducing a tax incentive, I'm going to solve this problem. I think, for example, on the financial side, actually many things have been done which are only just coming into play. For example, the infrastructure debt fund. I mean, worked on it for the last 18 months. It was finally made possible somewhere last year. I think right now he's put both the two windows, the one which is with an NBFC and the one which is like a mutual fund, on a comparable tax basis. That system is now ready to play. Now, I think that if foreign investors who want to invest in India are reassured by the series of messages which are cancelling out some of the negative images that had come last year, postponement of GAR is a major step. I mean, let me say, you know, if those things hadn't been done, you could have kick-started your motorcycle, but it would have just gone upside down. So I feel the preparatory ground for a lot of hard work has been done. Now, someone is right in saying that then we should lay out a roadmap. In 3 months' time, how many projects get cleared? That's the right way of looking at it. Now, Finance Minister said that the Cabinet Committee on Investment has had 2 meetings, it's already taken some decisions. I'm very confident that in, say, another month or 6 weeks, we will be able to say, well, look, these projects that were stuck have come unstuck.
Right.
Now, the other point is that the principles that will have been applied to get them unstuck will apply to other projects also. So frankly, we are dealing with a complex, difficult situation, and we should be not looking at images like Kickstart.
Right, okay, we're going to have to leave it there.
We should be looking at better than that.
We're going to roll along, maybe gently push, not kickstart. Thanks very much indeed, Montek Singh Ahluwalia, Sumant Sinha, Srivatsa Krishna, Vivian Fernandez, my colleague in Network 18. You've not said a word, but I just want you to quickly respond to what you've heard very quickly. We're out of time. You continue with the belief that this is a good budget?
I think the finance minister must be measured against the tasks that he had set for himself, and I think on those points he's done a good job, but a lot depends on how the cabinet pulls together as a team. Day before yesterday we had a railway budget. How
much the party supports the
We had a railway budget day before yesterday and it was totally non-reformist.
Right.
So a lot depends on other ministers also being as reformist
being part of the reforms mindset. Indian politicians not known for their reforms mindset, but there is a new word that has come into the economic survey yesterday which was hopeful. In place of populism we had aspiration. Aspiration of young people. Can aspiration be the word around which politicians become interested in and therefore become interested in economic reforms? But thank you very much indeed. I'm going to ask you gentlemen to hold up your cards on what you think about this, about the budget, so we can end the show on that note. All right, Vivian saying good, Srivatsa saying good, and Sumant saying average to good. Thanks gentlemen very much indeed for joining us on this budget special. As we go into break, let's listen to what you are telling us about this budget.